Welcome to the Urban Complex, a system of interrelated emotion-charged ideas, feelings, memories, and impulses. This name takes us and lays out what a listener should expect, a podcast where ideas, feelings, and memories collide, leading towards meaningful change. All opinions by Chris Richardson, Dominic Papa, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Arizona State University or the Arizona Commerce Authority. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for decisions. Any endorsement or messages from sponsors are solely supporting the production of this podcast. There are no relationships further than the podcast purposes with any sponsor unless separately created with another entity. Enjoy the Urban Complex. Smarter cities for a stronger tomorrow.
All right, Chris, here we are. We're in March. How you doing today, man?
I'm excited. Another great set of guests. Good yin and yang, I believe. But to me, it's just interesting. You know, month 3 of doing this, weekly producing. I think what sticks out to me is I just keep learning. You'd think asking some, I'm sure by now our audience sees we ask. We have a kind of standard format. We find some broad themes. We also dig into what they're good at, and I keep learning even on the broader themes. So to me, like, if I'm learning and we're contributing, and our audience keeps coming and asking fun stuff outside, I just get the coolest emails after this. So yeah, I don't know, it just gets me pumped.
I think.
How about you?
Yeah, I think I've texted you after some of these and been like, wow, if nothing else, I am learning so much from these in my own professional development that it's helping me out in my day job. You know what I mean? So I think it's been phenomenal. I think what's really exciting to me, though, is seeing the excitement from like kind of some public sector leaders in my network, CIOs, city managers, even deputy mayors themselves from kind of around the country reach out and say, hey, can we be guests on your podcast? You know, people from New York to San Diego to Washington to even one in Italy is excited to come on and be a guest because people want to tell their story because we learn best through stories. And so if the more we can get these leaders on to tell their stories, the more they're learning, but then the more they're wanting to share. And I think that's the best part. You know, our whole goal was get people on to share their stories so that way we can all benefit. So I think it's been a fun journey. We're only on month 3. Oh boy. I guess this is why I have no hair, you know? So,
yeah, but March is lined up. We have such great stuff coming. And to your point, like, we've got some great storytellers here. I know Simon, Sylvester-Chaudhuri. He's just, the guy can talk, but he knows his stuff. And he's been there since the beginning, and he knows how to kind of morph. I'm really excited to see. I didn't know him before an introduction from a colleague of mine at Amazon Web Services. Jason Whitted opened the doors and said, hey, this is a guy you want to talk to. Yeah. And then through that, he said, hey, you need to get my Yang, which is Emily Dabish. She runs his Detroit side. So we're going to get some perspective from those building collaborative centers in New York City and Detroit. Should be a blast.
Yeah, that's what's so exciting. Two city effort right here. This is going to be really interesting, I think. Shall we get them on?
Let's do it.
Go.
All right. Simon and Emily, please let Dom and I give you a warm welcome to the podcast, The Urban Complex.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, you guys. Good to be here this morning.
Yeah, appreciate the time.
No problem. Okay, so, we like to start off with just a little background about yourselves. It helps our audience kind of know where you're coming from. So just tell us a little bit about yourselves and what do you want the audience to know about yourselves before we'll get to Civ Lab in a bit, but just tell us about yourselves, Emily and Simon.
Sure. So I'm with Civ Lab and I lead our efforts in Detroit. I suppose going into a conversation, best thing to know about me is that my perspective has been framed by working in politics and government. I worked with the city of Detroit. I worked with the governor's office in Michigan. Education was political science, public management, and seeing the changes that have occurred in government, working in Detroit during the bankruptcy years, I got to see what happened when programs and projects happened with a rapid cadence, and also items that moved a little bit more slowly, and how that affects citizens, how that can affect technology outcomes. I've also worked with an MSP comparable to a Google Fiber, a sister company of called Rocket Fiber. And we did a lot of work around the digital divide, working in government relations, and as I think about smart cities, think about urban tech, it's framed by what I've seen on the ground and, seen in local communities.
Yeah, thanks for that. When Simon suggested to have you on, and I was looking at your background, I was like, wow, she's like the prototype. We haven't really had a prototype guest of who would represent smart cities, but like poli-sci background, working for city, working for governor, and just doing the tech side too. So it's been a great mix. So thanks for joining us. All right, Simon, sorry to cut you off. I think you're up.
No, and we're great partners because my background is probably a little bit more entrepreneurial and driven by a search of purpose in life. And my job really with Civ Lab is to take us off the rails, and Emily's job is to bring us back on the rails. And so
yin and yang.
We make a pretty good team with the kind of entrepreneur and policy backgrounds. But going way back, I grew up in Kansas, Manhattan, Kansas, the Little Apple, and I'm of half Italian descent, and my mom actually grew up near Detroit, and so that's kind of why one of the reasons we were inspired, or I was inspired to start working there. But I actually moved to Italy and then the UK. I'm actually currently in London, and I lived here for about 7 or 8 years. Did my undergrad here. And then ended up in New York for about a decade, and I've been based there for the last decade, and ended up doing some policy work, mostly looking at energy and clean technology, and then kind of from an entrepreneur's perspective, when we're looking at startups, we're always thinking about who the customers are, and really in clean tech, our customers were real estate developers, their utility companies, their cities themselves, obviously residents, and as someone who isn't an engineer and building things, but more of a catalyst and enabler for entrepreneurs or startups, I decided to take a more broad approach and not just look at clean technology, but urban technology more broadly. And so, the inspiration of Civ Lab, I know we'll talk about it in a little bit, but kind of from where I'm coming from is my attempt to continue to be global in my life and still work in this urban tech field. And I've just been thrilled to partner with Emily to do so.
Well, and I like that we brought in the Detroit side. It's funny, both my parents grew up in Michigan as well, and my mom was from Flint. My grandfather worked at General Motors for quite some time, so this will be neat to check it out. Okay, so let's shift. Thanks for those introductions about yourselves. Let's talk a little bit about Civ Lab. Really interesting concept. Tell us what it is and where it's going, and what it's going to be as it continues to evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there are a number of crises facing civilization, climate change. We're running into obviously COVID, things like social mobility, food access, and we look at about 3 different pillars from infrastructure, economic development, accessibility, but across a number of different sectors. And I spoke about energy and clean tech being one of them, but we're also looking at mobility, buildings, housing, wastewater, ag. And really our goal is to look at how do we create better collaboration between city actors that leads to positive impact for tackling urban problems. And the kind of backstory behind that is I mentioned that I was in New York, and I was studying at NYU at their Center for Global Affairs, Energy Policy. But I ended up getting a job as an intern at this little incubator called Acre. And at the time, there were only a few incubators in New York, period. But it was a growing time when Mayor Bloomberg was investing lots of money into the space to make entrepreneurialism kind of the next big thing, understanding that you have to use that to attract young people and kind of keep the economy going. And
by the way, is that the incubator where you met Jimmy and Jerry?
That was the incubator where I met Jimmy and Jerry. Yeah. So it was part of NYU Tandon incubators. There were 3 at the time. And in the back corner of one of them, led by a guy named Micah Koch, who now leads UrbanX's global accelerator based in Brooklyn, there was this small clean tech portfolio. I think we maybe had no more than 8 companies, 5 sitting there. All have actually done pretty well with a few exits. And we were kind of this group in the corner that was there and doing different new things, but no one really understood. And it was one of the first kind of clean tech incubator models in the United States. And then Hurricane Sandy happened. And after Hurricane Sandy, Mayor Bloomberg was such a great leader, not just in the moment, but thinking of the future as well. And so following the hurricane, the New York City Economic Development Corporation, one of our biggest partners now, actually put an RFP out for about $1 million to build a new center for urban and clean technology. I was fortunate enough to work on that grant and help win it, and then end up building what's called the Urban Future Lab, which is in downtown Brooklyn. And I was there for about 3 years, and we had hardware, software, business model innovations, all reducing climate change in some way. But I was spending my days there, but actually still studying at the Center for Global Affairs at night. And I was really fascinated with how could we take these innovations from the Urban Future Lab and scale them to other places that had these sustainability and resiliency mandates. And NYU had 2 engineering school campuses in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai that Jerry Holton, my colleague, that would be my future colleague, helped build. And I got a fellowship, and I was fortunate to go there and actually even convince them to open up an incubator. But one realization was, before they were ready for clean tech incubators, they just needed a tech incubator in the first place. But it really got me thinking about A, how do we scale innovation globally? But B, retroactively thinking, well, what does it take locally? And we were really a community there, and at the time, the only urban tech incubator really in the States, but in New York. And we had support from multiple universities, not just NYU. It was with Columbia, Cornell, CUNY. We had support from the private sector like Microsoft and Samsung, as well as a number of government agencies and the utility companies. And it was really just a community and hub. And so fast forward a little bit, I actually left the incubator, started a company called Global Futures Group with Jerry. And we ended up noticing that there was a gap in the smart cities market in the US, and it wasn't quite as advanced as it was in Europe. And at the time, Jerry had been the chairman of Smart Cities Expo World Congress in Barcelona. And so we decided, well, let's build the same thing in New York. That could probably be a podcast in itself. And it was great. It was a great story of lots of great people. We did town halls on the ground to build it with the community. But ultimately, we built that to about 2,000 to 3,000 people a year, 300 cities, 30 countries. And one of the best things to come out of it was meeting Emily. Emily came to one of our conferences and actually hosted a whole panel on Detroit. And so that was when the beginning of our relationship. But ultimately, I wasn't really a conference person. And, from the point I had left the Urban Future Lab to then, New York had gone from 1 urban tech incubator to nearly 10. I had mentioned UrbanX, the accelerator. We also have New Lab, which is this unbelievable spot for hardware at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We have Grand Central Tech or Company and the Urban Tech Hub there, which is where actually our office is, focusing more on kind of enterprise, IoT, big data, mid-stage companies, Civic Hall that looked at civic and GovTech. And just like Urban Future Lab, each one had its distinct set of partners. And so it kind of came to a point in New York where we had so many people working on city stuff, but it wasn't a coordinated effort. And it was probably too competitive at times when it shouldn't have been, and it should have been more collaborative. Even though
you became like the equivalent of the fund of funds for hedge funds. You were
the
incubator of incubators.
You know what? Yeah, exactly. And so we, the EDC also recognized this problem and put an RFP out there. I started a nonprofit. I was really fortunate enough to win the RFP, and that was kind of what launched Civ Lab. And now we run this program in New York City called The Grid. And we're 130 organizations, public sector, private sector, academic, nonprofits, VC, startups. all of the aforementioned groups I mentioned, but also groups like Microsoft and Citibank and even like groups on the ground like the Queens Public Library or the Red Hook Initiative, all the major academic institutions. And we work together to identify problems, solve them, and scale them. And now we've been working in Detroit for a couple of years, starting to be a couple of years now, and looking at some other places too.
That's great.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, what a fantastic background. And I mean, you guys are doing such great work. So I'll be interested in kind of this next question as we lead into this, because you've touched on a lot of it in that kind of background on how Civ Labs got created and kind of what you're doing now. But what we like to do, this is a Smart Cities podcast. And the running joke is, what is the definition of smart cities? No one knows. You ask 10 mayors, you're going to get 12 answers. So I think this is going to be a really good question for both of you, because it's kind of looking at you two, it's kind of like looking at Chris and I'm the political science background, focus on local government. Chris is more the venture side of things, really interested in kind of the specific tech. So we both have very dramatically different definitions of smart cities. So I would love to pose to you both, kind of what's your view of smart cities? What are they? And kind of how is Civ Labs, what are you guys doing in particular to kind of move the smart city movement forward, which you've kind of touched on a little bit, but would love to hear you kind of deep dive a little bit more on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we speak to our partners regularly and ask them the same question. How are you defining a smart city? As we engage with them and get their perspective and work to be on the same page. But it's so interesting. Before you really get involved in the space, so many of us imagine smart cities as, futurism, some extreme high tech, interesting vehicles, all sorts of things that haven't quite hit the ground yet. But, to me, working especially with government and doing a lot around, broadband expansion, digital divide work, what I came to see is, to me, a smart city in a technologically open urban space is one that is agile and accessible. And a truly smart city, I think, is one that is able to, not be stagnant, to allow for a platform to do an intake of technology as it changes, and to really, mobilize city services in a way that increases the quality of life for residents. Otherwise, whatever is being developed is a trinket or something that will get shelved. And to me, the planning and the ability to be agile is so key in, being successful in, cities placing out RFPs or different companies looking to do partnerships on the ground. I will go into, my feelings in this space a little bit more, but I think that with Simon and our work in the past year, we've scaled so much in Detroit. The bulk of our work in Detroit has taken place formally over the last year and a half. And most of that time has been, taken up during a pandemic. And so much of our work has been conducted virtually. And we have seen, both through the grant proposals that we've partnered in and our, neighborhood organizations and even businesses that we work with in Detroit, and, Simon can talk about New York in more detail as well, is that, COVID, first with the increase in cases and now with the vaccine rollout, we can see so clearly how important technology and open sourcing information is. How do we make available these different items to the public so that they can understand what's going on? And to me, the dashboard that Hopkins created, looking at different cities and, county health departments that are trying to share their information, those that are doing well to allow citizens the intelligence that they need to know to make good decisions. To me, that's a great example or a perspective into what a smart city is in maybe a less glamorous way. And, it's been extremely interesting in the past year to see. I think that what has been happening has allowed for greater buy-in for our organization, and that all sectors, whether academics who may have been already bought in, or behemoth organizations to startups, everyone's on the same page that we need to talk to each other. And if we're not talking to each other, people are going to be the ones that get hurt. Our neighbors are going to be the ones that might suffer if we are not, collaborating. And so it's been a very interesting experience over the past several months. And I think that so many perspectives have shifted.
It's amazing, the collaboration. If that's not happening, things get lost. And by the way, back to the broadband, we like to make fun of ourselves a little bit here. Between Scottsdale and Phoenix and Detroit and London, we are having a little challenges. We'll see how this works out. But you can tell even in the best cities, we need improvement on broadband.
Sure.
Huge focus area for us over here in Phoenix right now and in our rural areas. But we've been watching Detroit. I've been watching Detroit with a very big wide eyes. You guys are doing some absolutely amazing things. So kudos to you. Keep up the incredible work there. Simon, anything about, New York? It's one of the traditionally well-known smart cities when you kind of look at, the top 10 list. Anything that the city does particularly well that in your opinion, you would kind of consider them a really smart city? I think collaboration has come up a handful of times, and I totally agree. But anything from your perspective about NYC?
Yeah, and even tying that to the smart city question, I think back of how many times I got asked that question while running the Smart City Conference. And to your point about New York, it being smart cities, New York, your mind goes to, well, where does the list start? But, I think as I've been in this space longer and as things like, COVID really changed my perspective. And especially in New York, I think we all have our minds, or a lot of us have our minds on equity. And, as a baseline for a city, it needs to be equitable and providing a high quality of life for its residents, right? Everything else is, before that and should lead to that. And what COVID really taught me about New York specifically is it's a responsive city. It's a collaborative city. I think, I didn't move there until much after 9/11, but I think, you talk to New Yorkers that were there, and there was a different sense of community, especially for a 7 to 8 million, person city that happened after 9/11. And we saw that with COVID and particularly, the responsiveness. We saw new ways that we could leverage the grid in our urban tech collaborative. So when COVID happened, I'm fortunate enough to speak to a number of people in city government on a daily basis. And basically it was like, everyone do as much as you can for as many people as you can with the resources you have, understanding you might not have resources here or there, but like we all hands on deck, we need your help. And so my team started just going out and identifying various different problems around the city, and then going back to the list of all of our 130 members and saying, well, who can solve this one? Or who could we team up to solve this one? My favorite example was in the neighborhood of Red Hook, which, Red Hook is home to the second largest, affordable housing district in New York, and largest in Brooklyn. And there were a lot of residents who didn't know if they were so symptomatic that they needed to go to the hospital. And so we worked with the Red Hook Initiative and Councilman Carlos Menchaca, who's running for mayor now. And Carlos set up a phone bank using campaign tactics where they were calling residents using all the numbers they had. We brought in Cornell Tech and my colleague Arnaud to work with some other scientists to build an algorithmic engine that would prioritize symptoms. We went to Columbia University and got it translated by their language department in 8 or 9 different languages. And then we had a whole team of medical professionals to talk to the folks that had the highest symptoms. And this engine, if you were mildly symptomatic, it knew to give you a call like 5 days later. If you had high symptoms, you get a call immediately. And we ended up doing nearly 10,000 calls and saving lives. So, and that was literally like, let's just see who can help. And we have about 9 or 10 different projects similar to that. We've been doing vaccine town halls with the New York Academy of Sciences and our partners at Public Sentiment. And so it was kind of that responsiveness that was a new element for me as part of a smart city, and really somewhere where I thought New York shined.
Yeah, that is incredible. What a powerful story. It just goes to show you that kind of that power, that network, right? The power of collaboration, what you can actually do when you all work together and you're all talking, you're all collaborating. That's amazing. But sometimes, you know, some cities are on kind of a different path towards, I guess, smartness. You know, they might just be getting started, or maybe you're a new mayor, you're a new council member, you're a new city manager or CIO coming into a city that's hasn't really started the smart city journey yet. You know, for instance, around Greater Phoenix, we had a handful of new mayors elected in November. So what would your advice be to either, you know, a new mayor coming in or maybe a city manager looking to really get the kind of smart city ecosystem moving in their communities? What would your recommendations be to them, and how would you tell them where to look to get started?
Yeah, I think that within City Hall, departments were not organized necessarily in a way where there's a ton of collaboration across what department heads do in terms of permitting. And what I've seen as it relates to, autonomous vehicles, mobility access, development of infrastructure, is that there is a huge lack of communication between sometimes what the innovation director wants or the mobility chief and what traffic and engineering is willing to expedite or put up with. And then, you compound that with the state having a totally different permitting process, different access issues, and where so many of, our smart city initiatives are based around infrastructure, and infrastructure has not necessarily been developed to a point where, true connectivity among devices or vehicles is happening. I think that someone who is a leader in city government needs to take into consideration, how are the departments talking to each other? What are the priorities of the different heads? What are we doing with our relationship at the state level? And, certainly cities have the opportunity to, allow for pilots and to sort of expedite what would be a traditional RFP process. But how can a city think through that process and write an RFP in a way that allows for a transition of technology or building upon what an initial request is, rather than, taking a snippet of an opportunity and make it, very concrete and not allow for, addendums or additions or, the ability to access new tech or new development that the community might not be anticipating. So I think that understanding the structure of government and knowing the different barriers that I think that a lot of folks might not anticipate immediately, is very helpful. In Detroit, the city has been quite aware of these different issues. Still, I see the frustrations with permitting and, where certain districts or areas might be isolated and, a smart kiosk might go up, or, there's a few AV friendly or, smart traffic signals on a corner. Without that isolation and a ton of effort from 12 different stakeholders and different sectors, those items can't really move forward, and those things are still quite difficult to scale, and it's cutting through a lot of red tape. I would say they'd have to prepare for that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, just to congratulate you, at least from the outside, we're watching what you are doing over there, and it seems like that level of government challenge, state and local, it seems to me that Detroit and Michigan are getting that really well. Justin Snowden in Detroit and Trevor Powell, at least at the state level, we've been really watching you guys in the collaboration. It seems to be there between that state and local. I mean, has that just formed naturally, or did it take time, process to really, kind of get the two levels of government really working together?
I think that it's been going on maybe for 7 or 8 years. Governor Snyder and Governor Whitmer, I think, have in common that, as Detroit goes, so goes the state.
Mm-hmm.
And where sometimes statewide, that might be a frustration for other players who are looking for funding for their communities or, resources to be sent to their communities. I believe that over the past 2 administrations that there has been increased conversation and, a significant willingness to work together. And, certainly it's been very helpful, where you see the state, like, a Trevor and a Justin, collaborating so closely, and, a lot of work that's been getting off the ground. But the city was not always, perceived well. There was not a want always to, really roll up your sleeves and do the hard work for Detroit. So it's been evolving, but we've almost got 10 good years under our belt in doing development there.
That's awesome. It's a process.
I think that's consistent in a lot of places though, right, Dom? Like just the old way of working, it was very efficient to just operate within your silo and or put up these guardrails against threat to the regime, and or change or whatnot. And I had the luxury of talking to Mitchell Weiss yesterday, the author of We the Possibility. He's a PhD, or excuse me, a professor at Harvard around smart cities and concepts. And he had this theme. We're going to get him on the podcast, by the way, Dom. This theme that the biggest risk is not getting started, and that starting is the collaboration, because that's the core. And so it's really interesting to hear you talk about how that's formed, and it's a 10-year process. But there are ways to jumpstart. So let's keep going with that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
One thing I'll add to, I think one thing that Detroit and its leaders there, if they've been bold, and, I think one problem we have in cities, and if I was going to give a mayor advice, I mean, it's two things. One is the obvious, which an entrepreneur will tell you: talk to your customers who are your citizens, right? Like that just kind of goes without saying. But, I think too often in our political society, we get tied up with elections and terms, and it holds mayors back from doing the things that are best for their cities over the long term. And I don't think that has necessarily been, I don't think those political distractions have necessarily been the case in Detroit from my perspective. And I think that's really important if you're going to move a city forward.
Hey, Simon, before we jump to the next question, I think there's an interesting thing in there. To you, that's an entrepreneur, and to me, that's pretty entrepreneurial. Talking to the customer is natural. To a politician, talking to the citizen is natural. However, I think Dom and I have learned that the way they've been talking isn't necessarily the perfect way to get the result we're talking about. So I really think you should go into how they might want to talk to the citizen, because just an open forum town hall, let's say that's their way of checking the box that they're talking to the citizen, may not be the best move for them, right? 30 to 50 people show up. It's always the same squeaky wheel. Any advice for really getting to know the citizen, both intimately and at scale, in ways that are going to understand the right personas for change? Out of curiosity, sorry to put you on the spot, but I think it's an important one.
No, it's a great question. I think we think so much about cities of the organizations that are part of them, and not being from a neighborhood or community, usually means that it's going to take some massaging to be able to speak transparently and learn from them transparently. And so, there are lots of great community-based organizations out there. They are a crucial part of our steering committee in Detroit, looking at neighborhoods like Osborne, and they're a crucial part of our grid organization in New York. And if we didn't have those types of organizations, we'd lack connectivity to those parts. And the more and more we look at cities, the more and more, for me, they're very layered, and it could be or siloed, and it could be by organization type, it could be by neighborhood. And so, leveraging I think our kind of social infrastructure to navigate that is something that is difficult, but essential if you really want to get in tune and touch.
That's interesting. Are you actually saying that Civ Lab's part of your value proposition, actually surfacing the conversation for the members of city? Do you help with that?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to do a lot more in that, and actually,
That's great.
Our partners at they're called Public Sentiment, and they've been working with the neighborhood of Brownsville to do looking at neighborhood feedback, and it's been an interesting journey for them, and we've been really and it happened primarily because of COVID, but there is so much to learn from our neighborhoods, and there are so many different neighborhoods, and even those neighborhoods are broken down into different pieces, and so it's really difficult for our organizations to fully understand what's going on in the cities and how they can fully be part of a larger ecosystem with the citizens themselves. And so
are you satisfied with Nextdoor representing those different neighborhoods?
What's that?
Are you satisfied with Nextdoor representing those neighborhoods for the conversation you're looking for?
Well, potentially. I haven't worked with Nextdoor enough or spoken to them enough, but they obviously pull out some great insights on how you can improve neighborhoods. But one thing I did want to say is, not necessarily at the neighborhood level, but as an entrepreneur, and we've had some great CIOs and CTOs, in New York and across the country and in the world. And the ones who do their job the best, I think, are the ones that, speak transparently or offer even data at a transparent level to the community, because, there are a lot of hungry, smart entrepreneurs out there looking to solve the next problem in cities to make either their city or someone else's city a better place. And the more information and more transparent we can be about the problems our cities have, the more opportunities our entrepreneurs have to solve them.
That's great. I love that. The political admin nerd in me is geeking out over this conversation right now. I think we could talk about kind of advice to city leaders all day long. But let's pivot. Speaking of entrepreneurs, let's pivot to kind of the Civ Lab focus around venture and the startup ecosystem. So kind of help us and help our kind of audience understand kind of those direct and peripheral benefits that you and your organization have kind of helped create in those ecosystems.
Yeah, so I'll speak to Detroit. Detroit is a city where it's easy to discover sometimes like who the major players are and what the major institutions are. We are an auto town. There's a major influence also coming from financial technology with Quicken Loans. And there are also very old nonprofits, foundations. There's a lot of the same folks that pop up in, city leadership. And there's, with that, this burgeoning ecosystem of startups, of tech companies. And when we look at Detroit, so often we would see a very strong networking system for the tech startups, similarly in the public sector and government with the different foundations, but so many communities, and we would see it in Detroit, they are siloed off. And we would see, the autos working together or the city just beginning to have conversations. And we wanted to, so expand upon that. And so while we look at the startup ecosystem, we can recognize that public actors can have a positive influence and can, major institutions that can usher in funding, lend their expertise, find different ways to pilot or to get involved. And so when we work with the community, we analyze what's happening on the ground. We try to figure out who's talking to each other and who is not through interviews, formal analysis. But it really comes to turn to understanding this market. And it's something unique that I think, we have developed in realizing where the gaps are and where, based on our connections, both locally and, around the country, around the world, can be brought in to enhance whatever development is or is not taking place. And sometimes that's more formally through applications and propping up different projects, or it can be through, instituting conversations and bringing the right people together. And so with Civ Lab, it's about looking at what is a locally supported outcome and contemplating in a way that's tangible, what are these different cross-sector collaborations that can occur to help bolster startups. It can help, allow the city government to, see successes in this area, because when small businesses are able to be successful, the city is more successful. And, fortunately, we've made that case in Detroit, we've made that case in New York, and, we've been able to get traction that way. And so the analysis and really understanding the people and the different folks that are involved in different ways is so key in having a strong ecosystem and realizing who might be adjacent to the work that you are doing that you can build upon.
And I just want to add to that quickly from the kind of startup perspective, or even in like incubators perspective. I spoke about Urban Future Lab before, and I think I spent about 3 years there. And while my head was probably mostly down on the ground with the startups and learning from my great mentors there, at the end of those 3 years, our first 3 years, we, I think, created 175 jobs in addition to the founders of those startups, and raised $165 million in venture capital and grants that went back into the New York City ecosystem. So if you ask me, was that a good investment by the city and even NYSERDA and the state, it contributed money? I'd say absolutely yes. And that's what made me so passionate about this space is I can save the world and reduce climate change and create jobs at the same time. Let's go. And, coming from someone who studied commercialization so much, we look at kind of like a commercialization timeline from start to finish. And, that starts with identifying problems, figuring out solutions, turning them into technologies, then to products, then to seed capital, then to, incubators and accelerators, Series A, B, C, all the way to an exit. And we look at, well, who are the institutions that play a role and when do they play a role? So often in the early days, it's going to be academic institutions and even government helping identify issues that need to be solved. And then you see obviously kind of corporates play a role later on, and even the real estate community, et cetera. And so, our job, and it's not our only job, but is to look at the innovation ecosystem holistically and see where can we get those groups to partner at the appropriate time. So that is a seamless model for commercialization and job creation in New York and Detroit.
So that Hurricane Sandy opportunity of $1 million investment led to 175 jobs and 165 million in VC.
And the 3 years after that, it doubled those numbers, and it's probably more since then.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Hey, out of curiosity, any actual companies to highlight that might be a great guest? Like we've only had really one kind of startup, although it's already a $11 billion valuation, Axon, on the podcast. But are there any that you think fit the bill, that we're in that ecosystem, that are just doing amazing things that you can share the story?
Yeah, I mean, from that ecosystem, there's, gosh, the list goes on. Honest Buildings, who actually was acquired by Procore, which I think is in Arizona, was one of them. Think Eco, but we could go on, and I could give you a long list of startups in the New York and Detroit ecosystems that would be great fits. But one of the ones I've kind of been inspired with, and we've been working with a lot most recently, her name's Dana Chermesh. She studied at NYU Center for Urban and Science Progress. She's an architect by background, and she has a company called In Situ, and she's looking at how do you leverage AR and VR for the built environment, and even looking at social equity in neighborhoods and cities before you build things. And she's now an entrepreneur in residence at Schmidt Futures. And I think she'd just be a phenomenal guest. She's worked with Emily at looking at stuff in Detroit as well. I don't know if Emily, you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, she's been phenomenal, and she really understands how accessibility affects residents, and her work is focused on we talk about this issue of town halls and the squeaky wheel getting the grace. Dana definitely gets that. And she wants to work with communities and go into communities and show them what's possible through AR, through VR, whether that's related to something like, real estate development or, different community possibilities and activities. And so, she's, has a great energy and, is really thoughtful about the way that we communicate with folks and, are able to imagine the world around us.
Yeah, and you guys both spoke to
one thing go ahead, Don.
Oh, I was just going to say, you spoke to something really interesting there, and that I've been really trying to grapple with about this idea of kind of how do we port these solutions to other cities around the country, so that way, or around the world even, so that way we can kind of accelerate, the solution to these challenges that we all face. From my perspective, I'm just trying to do it with 22 cities around Greater Phoenix, trying to get them to share solutions to common challenges. How can we as cities really start to work together to take a solution that's maybe developed in a lab, an urban lab in New York, and port it to Detroit, or then port it to Phoenix, or port it to San Diego? What can we do better as cities or even ecosystems to do that in your minds? Because you're doing it seems like really well between, New York and Detroit, but that's because they have you two all-stars there. How do we expand that, to now take that to other places around the country?
Well, I would say that it's much, much harder than I ever anticipated, in the sense that the idea was actually initially a global network before it was local. And, transparently, yes, we do some of that, and we'll do some introductions, but we don't have an active daily role in bringing technology from one place to another. However, what our thesis has kind of evolved into is, like, pardon my French, but before we start moving things globally, let's get our shit together at home. And I think the best things cities can do for, helping their local startups scale is giving them a chance at home first, because startups can't do anything if they don't have any customers. And so that's really the first step. And, our approach has been like, let's help these ecosystem harmonize locally, try and give startups more opportunities at home. And then only then, when, we have an opportunity, we can start to connect cities. And we are seeing that. And it's not just startups, like it's our partners as well. So, New Lab, who sits on our steering committee in New York, has partnered with Ford in Detroit. And so it's not just us, it's a lot of other people looking at that. And we're also seeing that, the programming is starting to evolve, and it's not just accelerators and incubators, and the competitions are starting to get a little bit more creative than they were before. And a lot of cities use competitions to attract new technologies and solutions. The problem there is, like, is there enough? So I'm just gonna give two random cities. So say Tokyo has a competition for EV charging infrastructure. Well, the funding number's got to be pretty big for a company from New York to actually just go there and spend 3 months, right? Like, that's not a cheap move. So, that's still kind of an obstacle, but I think that's okay too, because I think the way we see it is, if there's a company in Detroit competing against a company in New York, we're starting to create a global market of competitiveness, which can only make things better as well. So, while this is our attempt at thinking locally and globally as well, and saying both are important. But and
that's an interesting point. I mean, well, clearly you're getting benefit from expanding the network, but keeping that local focus. Tell us a little bit about why London next. I know you're there right now, and I think you said you're pursuing that market. Anything about that? And I did promise you a certain set time, so hopefully we'll
no worries.
Don't want to keep you over the time we allotted. So
I'll keep London really quickly, but it's I did my undergrad here. I lived here for years after, and it's always been a place close to my heart. And I was brought here by personal reasons during the pandemic, but I'm also fortunate fortunate enough to teach at Imperial College Business School, a Future of Cities course. But really, it's that London has a great urban innovation ecosystem. And after speaking to a number of partners, they have the same issues that New York has, that Detroit has, that many other cities have, which is this ecosystem can be quite siloed sometimes. And so we've been working with the University College School of Management on doing a landscape study and looking at, the startup ecosystem where great companies like Citymapper have come from, and looking at the academic ecosystem where LSE has an amazing cities program, UCL has some amazing urban programs, as well as King's College with their urban informatics program. And so we're exploring whether we could build something here. And the really interesting challenge for us, which also gets us excited, is it's such a different city. It's actually kind of similar to LA in that the city of London is actually in the very middle, and then there are all these boroughs around it, kind of like LA has like all these cities around it. And so there's a very interesting dynamic between the work that is going on in boroughs and to the city as a whole, and in a really good way as well, which makes it those boroughs more localized, right? But then they've had to get creative and do things like build the London Office of Technology and Innovation, which is meant to help the boroughs pool their resources or gain economies of scale when they're trying to implement new smart cities tactics. So we'll see what happens here, but we've started to build a really great little team here, and it's the people are fantastic and creative, and we've also been working with some colleagues in Berlin at Urban Impact who are working with the city of Berlin to build a grid-like model. And from our perspective, we're not trying to be competitive. We think they're brilliant, and we're looking at ways to collaborate and expand our networks. And so we're starting to see some interesting things in other cities, not just in the UK, but across Europe and in the world as well.
Great. Well, I'll tell you what, at least speaking for me, I'm sure Don is the same. I love New York. I've heard great things about Detroit. We can't keep you on forever. So maybe when we get you on next time, we'll do it in one of your cities, and that'd be fun. Such great things. We do have 2 standard questions. Is there anything as we wrap up that you want the audience to know? Like, you can't do it on your own. Anyone to call out as an appreciation or just a major event? I mean, you mentioned this Hurricane Sandy thing earlier. Like, anyone that really catalyzed what you're doing that you think is worthy of highlighting here?
Yeah,
that list is long. But Emily, why don't you go and then I'll go.
Yeah, in Detroit, we had so many wonderful informal partners. And this was prior to us launching our Detroit network, our Detroit programming. But ultimately, I think our thank needs to go to Wayne State University and their sister incubator, TechTown. They had the vision for Detroit Urban Solutions, our partner program, and they have been an awesome partner and, so interested in, our perspective and the way that we envision, bolstering the network, bolstering the ecosystem in Detroit. So have to, thank them for their consistency and their willingness to listen to our experiments and ways that we envision working with the community.
Yeah, and one of the people that really connected us with Detroit, kind of inadvertently, was Bruce Katz, who I had actually met a couple of times in Scandinavia and kind of told him what we were doing, and he was like, "Well, you're doing kind of what I write about." And I'm like, "Yeah, exactly." And so he had worked with Mayor Duggan in the past, and so there was some nice connectivity there. And so his work and his writing has been a huge inspiration for us. And then just kind of more personally, people like Jerry Holton, who you mentioned before, just smart city veteran, if there ever is one. And he kind of offered me the platforms and really believed in me to not just do Civ Lab, but to help him build kind of some of his projects, along with our colleague Raj Panu, who has also been a great mentor. And then lastly, the New York City Economic Development Corporation, I can't say enough about them. For me, they're one of the organizations that are at that top tier of economic development in the world. They have great vision, great support, and it was not just funding that they provided. They helped build the grid, and they still contribute to today. And we really couldn't be here without them and partners like Techtown and Wayne State in Detroit.
Well, it's funny, Dom and I it's great memory with Jerry. He actually came out and emceed a year and a half ago, a full week of like 17 different events we had, including our Smart Region Gala that Dom put together. We had like 300 mayors that were at this amazing dinner, and Jerry was the MC. He even worked on this smaller project that we had, bringing together universities from around the nation. That we had, I think we had 50 individuals there. And he's just a character with tons of energy. And on that point, he'd be a great guest. And so I'm thinking, anyone else, as you got to know us, got to know the urban complex, that you think that we should have on as a guest in the future to kind of help tell the story of what a smart city is or could be?
Emily, do you have anybody?
Yeah, certainly I think some of the examples like, Dana and our partner network are great folks to get online, but, we love to stay in touch and to, think about how we can grow our community stronger.
And we'll definitely have to get you information on the Connective and what we're doing with the Smart City Cloud Innovation Center here, because we can see a lot of synergies. I see Dom taking notes. I've been taking notes throughout this. So, Simon, anyone last one from you?
Well, no, I was going to say we have a long list, but I've been particularly impressed with our colleague Chanel Bonavito Martinez, who's at the New York Academy of Sciences, who's doing a lot in STEM education in this space, which is something that we're trying to get a lot better about. I mentioned that the nonprofit public sentiment before, doing a lot of things at the neighborhood level, and our colleague Mike Lenahan would be great. But happy to share a long list of potential great speakers, and I look forward to tuning into future episodes.
Oh, thanks for that. Okay, well, as promised, got you right to the end. We got it around, kept the conversation flowing. And so with that, the Urban Complex gives a big note of thanks to today's guests, Simon Sylvester-Chaudhuri, Executive Director of Civ Lab, and Emily Dabish, Director of Civ Lab Detroit. Thanks for joining us. It's been a blast.
Yeah, thank you both. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Okay, wow. All right. As always, what do you think? Two folks you had met?
Yeah, I thought the conversation was phenomenal. Maybe it's my background of, starting the nonprofit here, trying to do kind of the similar work that they're doing in Detroit and New York City, obviously nowhere close to the maturity of them. But I just thought it was fascinating. And I kind of want to talk about the note I took with Emily's suggestion to kind of incoming mayors or city managers, CIOs that are trying to really get something started in their community. She really, and maybe this is the government side of us, she said, look internal first. First, figure out your own silos that are across departments. Look at the communication, work on things internally before you work on things externally, right? So I thought that was really interesting because you're right. There are groups that are out there like Civ Lab that are breaking down the silos and building the partnerships of the social ecosystem in your community, that if you can get your house in order, if you can really focus on breaking down those internal silos between departments, getting the collaboration going internally, and then even once you get it internally, maybe focus on the different levels of government, state to local, work on those silos, break those down. Don't really worry about, we have to focus on making sure we're working with every nonprofit. We have to make sure we're connected into the venture ecosystem. We have to make sure that's sometimes I think when new leaders come in and they look outside to the ecosystem, they get very scared. And it's, I think to your point, you brought it up, Chris, they get so scared they don't even start, right? And it's more important to just get started. And I thought Emily's advice to look internal first, look at something you can control and you can handle, break down the silos internally.
I think if you think about getting that started, they came in it from different perspectives. Like Simon comes at it from the entrepreneurial ecosystem and getting the change agent that's going to start the company, that's going to inspire, or that's going to create a solution. And Emily came at it from, hey, deep relationships with the city, deep relationships with the governor, and that understanding and catalyzing. And then also Simon talked about getting the neighborhoods together. And you start to think, like, that's the beauty of these solutions, is you look entrepreneurially, you galvanize citizens, you understand deeply their issues, you get the startup ecosystem to take that forward, you get the politicians and the city leadership on the same page, and great things can happen. And then you throw in, nothing like a crisis to jumpstart change. I know, I was queuing in on that. Hurricane Sandy allowed Simon his break to get an RFP for a new center that cost, started $1 million, and then boom, look at those results that he was talking about. And I know for us in COVID right now, like ASU, Arizona State, went like all in, and we completely changed. We built a hybrid delivery model of our university. We created our own health check. We created our own testing with saliva-based testing. Now we're in the phase where we're literally helping the state administer the vaccines. And oh, by the way, in IT, we completely changed our organization model in this time of change. We used it as a wind behind our sails to do some of the things we want to do and accelerate the pace of change. And I think that's a really interesting theme, whether you're not in crisis and you're finding the quote unquote entrepreneurs, the people that want to take action, that want to get the permission to take change and drive something different, that starts small and gets started. Yep. Or boom, when you're in the middle of it, really say, okay, we have the latitude to do something completely different because we're being forced by external circumstances. Right. Those to me, I think are things that anyone listening really need to key in on.
Yep. Yeah. And to that point, what Simon said around, there's so much government can do to help inject, even financial capabilities into their own local startup ecosystem. Don't, with their RFPs and the public procurements, really focus on how you can tailor those to help your local startup ecosystem solve those problems. That's a huge one for me. Don't worry about other people from around the world coming in and winning your RFPs. Try to figure out how to inject that money financially into your own local ecosystem. Be bold. I love that from Simon. So let's move on to cracks in the pavement. What do you think?
Well, I hate to say, there was such promise. Sidewalk Labs is headed again. I was just reading that they've now been, Portland has kind of pushed them out, and it's making a lot of the news today. And not too long ago, Toronto did the same, and it just gets me thinking, like, well, what happened? I wish we could get a guest that could talk about it either within one of those cities that's not bad mouthing, but really help us learn how we can have these big, bold moves. Back to our previous point with these guys, big, bold moves that don't create the stir of privacy or don't create this animosity. I don't know, thoughts?
No, I would love to have someone on, because we know the guys from Sidewalk Labs or Sidewalk Infrastructure Fund. They're phenomenal. It's a phenomenal group and a phenomenal organization with these big visions to help really change the way cities work in a positive way. And yet they continue to, it looks to run into these cracks in the pavement. So I'd be very interested to see what it is that's slowing them down. And, and what we heard from the Toronto experience was there wasn't that civic group, there wasn't that Civ Labs, there wasn't that New Lab, there wasn't that IDP, there wasn't that kind of community focused group that could really sit in the center of the partnership and represent the people and provide that level of trust, that level of transparency. I wonder if that's what was missing, or if there's maybe.
That's a really interesting point. That's a great point. Having the kind of arm of a for-profit company being at the center may not be the best solution, but if you have that group you can partner with that has this deep understanding and already built the trust, already brought the people together, there is space for those folks. It's a really good point, Dom. And I would bet that our Civ Lab folks, I'm sure with what you're doing at the Connective via Institute for Digital Progress, I would bet that'd be a perfect vehicle. It's a really good point.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me because, I think Simon talked about how the one council member wanted to better engage with the neighborhoods and didn't quite know how. So they were using that company called Public Sentiment. It's like those, locally nonprofit organizations that's focused on helping better the neighborhoods that you really, if you're trying to go into a new market, you really have to partner with, right? Because you might not know the culture on the ground, the history on the ground. And it's really important to bring these sorts of groups in. And so maybe that's it. Maybe it's not, who knows? Again, to your point, I think it'd be very interesting to get them on. So if anyone out there knows anyone that we can speak to, please reach out, let us know. We'd love to bring them on as a guest.
Definitely. Okay, well, with that, that's a wrap. You heard it here on the Urban Complex. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Keep ideas coming. We can bring your questions in the Cracks in the Pavement or for future guests. Hit us up on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and please keep the support. It's been a blast. See you next time.
It's been a fun 2 months. Let's keep going. Thanks a lot.